Christopher Nolan is one of the most important filmmakers of our generation. He is one of the few Hollywood filmmakers left who still values original made-for-big screen stories and audience-drawing spectacle. Despite the unceasing onslaught of cash grab IPs perpetuated by studios, Nolan is a director who loves movies. But part of what makes him so unique is his ability to tell stories in a way that feels big. Now, lots of movies claim epicness, scope, high stakes, or even IMAX worthiness, but what is it about Christopher Nolan movies that delivers above so many of these other films when it comes to making his movies feel big? Well, we are going to walk through his visuals, soundscape, and storytelling to find the answer to how Nolan makes his films feel so big. Given all the conversation around IMAX formats, how you should see his latest film Oppenheimer, let's first talk about how cinematography plays a part in making his stories feel big. Well, the most glaring element is the format in which he shoots his films, or at least his past several films, which are by and large shot in 70mm IMAX for select sequences, and 65mm film for more of the dialogue-driven sequences. Format is an interesting component because I think everyone thinks about the delivery of the format. In essence, seeing his films on the biggest screen as possible, that's part of it, but that doesn't really determine the aesthetic of the movies themselves. Why do they still feel big on your home TV? Now, there are countless videos on YouTube comparing the size of IMAX format film versus 70mm, 35mm, etc. But at the end of the day, 70mm IMAX is 15 per film, which means it's about 3 times the size of even regular 70mm film. So it's pretty obvious how that affects the viewing process in a movie theater. It's a bigger, more resolute image. But what about capture? How does that affect the aesthetics of the film itself? Field of view, depth of field, lens choice. Well, let's throw out the film formats for a second and talk about something you know, like digital camera sensors. And let's talk about Oppenheimer cinematographer Hoyte van Hoytema's primary lens choices for IMAX. So in the ASC magazine, Van Hoytema said the following about shooting Oppenheimer. Through the years, we have discovered that the sweet spots with IMAX are 50mm and 80mm. Anything beyond those focal lengths, and you start to diminish the immersive quality of the image. Now, without getting too mathy, let's translate this to a camera you might be using, such as a digital full-frame camera. A 70.41mm IMAX sensor divided by a 35.7mm full-frame sensor gets you a crop of 1.97, which means a 50mm IMAX lens gets you a full-frame equivalent of a 25mm lens, and an 80mm IMAX lens gets you a full-frame equivalent of a 40mm. Now, assuming what Van Hoytema said was true, that they pretty much just use those two lenses, one might think that Nolan would use the 25mm equivalent for the big grandiose shots, and perhaps the 40mm for the close-ups. I'm sure in some instances that's true, but in looking at many of his shots where scale is emphasized, I would actually wager that the 40mm equivalent of the IMAX 80mm is the actual lens being used for these big shots. Forgetting the end size of an IMAX screen and instead focusing on how a 40mm would look on a full-frame camera, it would have just enough width to fit landscapes, large structures, and all the elements that we would think of as big within a frame, but Christopher Nolan often stages his actors in the foreground and the big elements in the background, and the length of a 40mm is just long enough to compress the foreground and background together in such a way that everything on screen appears big. If you used a wider lens like a 16mm, only the foreground elements would appear big. Now, you might be skeptical. A wide lens feels intuitive for getting big elements on screen, but here's an example simply using my phone camera to demonstrate making a bird feeder look large compared to my sun in the foreground. The first image is using a 22mm lens, the second is at 2x, which is roughly a 44mm lens. The slightly longer wide-range 40mm lens gives us distance from the subjects, but also magnifies them on screen due to their focal length. In contrast, a wide lens like a 25mm up close often brings us into the psychology of the character. The longer 40mm lens gives us a slightly more voyeuristic view of the subjects, adding to the psychology of spectacle. Nolan often emphasizes the big elements in his frames by using protagonists in the foreground. This is an effect not unlike playing a third-person video game, which many would agree feels more personal and more immersive than playing a video game in first person. We put ourselves in the shoes of the character rather than literally seeing through their eyes, and by seeing the character in a relation to the big element on screen, we get a sense of scale and scope. Now, beyond the ways in which Christopher Nolan's choice of format affects how he photographs his films, or one could argue his cinematographer photographs them, I believe that practical effects play a role in our psychological perception of his films feeling big. And I don't think Christopher Nolan chooses to do this arbitrarily, or out of some false sense of nostalgia for practical effects. In a recent episode of the Happy, Sad, Confused podcast, he had this to say.
The issue with computer graphics for me is they're incredibly versatile, so it's a very seductive form, but there's a slightly anodyne, slightly safe quality to computer graphics.
It's almost too perfect that
it's almost too perfect.
Yourself.
Yeah, and I think there's also that kind of absolute realization on the part of an audience of what's animation and what's something that's being photographed, whether or not the thing being photographed is the actual thing, or whether it's a miniature representation or a more abstract representation.
There's something about the photographic capture of these elements without any digital intermediate that our brains are more willing to perceive as real. This sense of reality, whether true or perceived, I believe gives us a sense of weight to his films. There's nothing dismissed as cheap or off the shelf, and that weight adds to our psychology of big. And in the same vein of photographic capture, I believe that one final visual element that makes Nolan's films feel big to us is his use of film as a photographic format. Don't get me wrong, there are some amazing large capture formats for digital, and dozens of films that have a massive scope despite being filmed digitally. A movie being shot on film does not arbitrarily make it feel big, especially when looking at the movie shot on 60mm or in some cases 35mm. But as we know now already, the use of 70mm and 65mm has an aesthetic scale to it. But I think there is something psychological to his movies being shot on film that once again gives them a weight. It's a rarefied format in 2023, and one that we know is costly and special when it is used. Much like practical effects, I think that this rarity of format not only gives us more of a psychological weight to each of his films, but it also creates an event out of each of his film releases. There's only one moment in time when audiences can collectively go to see a Christopher Nolan movie shot on film and projected on film.
Something, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Audiences may not know the specifics of the format or may not even be able to articulate what makes the format special or subjectively better. They just know they want to be a part of something that feels limited and special, something that somehow feels more important than your local 40X showing of Transformers. And add to that the connection to dozens of films that hold weight in our collective memories. Films like Lawrence of Arabia, 2001: A Space Odyssey, Bridge on the River Kwai, many of which were filmed on 70mm, though not IMAX. Our zeitgeist connection to the film format adds a particular weight or bigness to our perception of Nolan's films. Beyond the visual aesthetics and use of format, Christopher Nolan also makes his movies feel big through his use of sound and music. Now, it's difficult to demonstrate music on YouTube without setting off copyright strikes, but if one is familiar with Christopher Nolan's films, you know that the music is not just loud, but it has an aesthetic bigness to it. Oppenheimer is no exception. For better or worse, the music propels the viewer through the story at a rapid-fire pace. The strings ground us in the humanity of the story, but the synthesizers demonstrate the weight and the scale. There's a limitless scope to synthesized music. It can feel dark and haunting or ethereal and euphoric. In Nolan's recent films, there's often a balance of classical and synthesized music, either composed by the renowned Hans Zimmer or more recently Ludwig van Göransson. And whether it's the thundering horns signaling the fold of cityscapes, ethereal church organs propelling us through the vastness of the universe, or strings and powerful synthesizers demonstrating the colossal effect of a nuclear bomb, or the inner workings of a brilliant mind, the music in Nolan's films feels big. It can be hard to describe, but you know it when you hear it. And married with that is his emphasis on sound. An aspect of his films that is often critiqued, and maybe fairly so. Despite that, Nolan knows the impact of sound design. His movies are loud. But that loudness, when released at calculated moments, can give you a massive sense of bigness.
There is a moment.
Whether it's the terrifying impact of a gunshot, the ear-splitting concussion of an explosion, or the silence of vast outer space. Love it or hate it, his use of sound and loudness or quietness is intentional and precise, and it has an impact that can be felt in the chest. It feels big. Beyond the aesthetics of big visuals and big sounds, Christopher Nolan's movies feel big because of the stories that he tells. They are stories that have scope to them. The visual stakes are of high importance, and we care because we are grounded in those big moments through intimacy with characters. Christopher Nolan rarely gives us a bird's eye view of the stories. He grounds us in the point of view of the characters. And as a result, we feel the scope and the weight of the consequences of collapsing cities that represent our loss of reality, the universality of losing time with the ones that we love, the experience of witnessing the deterioration of our beloved cities, the fate of our loved ones and how that impacts our homeland, or in the case of Oppenheimer, the gravity of a bomb that could destroy all of mankind. These stories are big, and though they may propel us through the universe, they mean something to us because we experience them through the eyes of grounded characters. The movies of Christopher Nolan feel big because they are big, sure, but there's something I think we can all learn from. Not just his tools and formats, but how he uses them to make his audience feel like they are experiencing something bigger than the odd Marvel movie. As filmmakers, we may never have the tools, stories, or the resources to make films on the scale of Christopher Nolan, but I think we can learn from them and how he uses these elements. And maybe we can use just a few of them to tell stories that feel important. Stories that feel